Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I am Daniel Felenia, and I will be your moderator for this plenary session entitled Copyright and Digital Developments, the Global Debate on Non-Fungible Tokens. I know it is already late in the afternoon, but I promise you that this session will be very interesting and intriguing as we are going to talk about your friendly neighborhood memes. On a more serious note, the popularity of non-fungible tokens has seen an unprecedented rise during the pandemic. The staggering price at which NFTs are sold and traded all the more contributed to the growing interest in this subject. This is IPOFIL BCRR's first ever webinar on the topic. By inviting the foremost authorities on the topic of NFTs, we hope to start on the path towards unraveling the seemingly very technical world of NFTs. To begin our plenary session, it is my honor and pleasure to call on Dr. Andres Cuadamos, who is a reader in intellectual property law at the University of Sussex and the editor-in-chief of the Journal of World Intellectual Property. He is a renowned author and a prominent figure in the field of IP. Professor Cuadamos, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to start sharing my screen. You're going to see something first. Right. Can you see my screen now? I hope this is now working. Okay. So thank you again for the kind invitation. I am very honored to be with you here today to talk a little bit about NFTs. Now, what I'm going to do is give an introduction to the subject in general, and then we're going to move into the copyright aspects that Michelle is going to be talking about. But I wanted to start, I always start my presentations with a bit of an apology. This is a very complex area, and I've been interested in the subject of cryptocurrencies, blockchain, for quite a long time. I wrote my first blog post on the subject 10 years ago. But my perspective on this comes from an interest in copyright, specifically in the area of NFTs. Now, I have written a full paper. I have put the details here on some of the copyright aspects, but I am not going to start talking about any of the copyright issues yet. I am going to start with an introduction to NFTs in general. My guess is that a lot of you are already very familiar with the subject, so I apologize in advance. This is probably going to be very boring for those of you who already know the subject. Hopefully, this will give us an introduction so that we can eventually talk about the copyright aspects in more detail. I also wanted to start with a disclaimer. I have been very interested in the subject. I've minted, bought and sold a few NFTs. However, I have managed to only lose money so far. So I come to this a little bit as a friendly skeptic in many ways. I am intrigued and interested by the subject. I think that there is a very interesting thing happening here, but also I think that sometimes the discussion on prices and discussion of the amount of money that is being traded can make us lose sight of the technology and some of the interesting developments that are happening. So with that in mind, I'm going to start with a very brief introduction to blockchain and smart contracts, because all of this is based in a system of blockchain protection. Now, by now, I think everyone has heard about blockchains. For the purpose of this presentation, all you need to know is that blockchain is quite simply an open, permissionless, cryptographic, decentralized ledger. This ledger is public and is decentralized. That means that everyone can have access to this. They can check past and present of proposed transactions. And if this serves to provide some reliability in the system. This chain is, you can create one on your own, or you can use one of the established blockchains that are in existence. The first one was, of course, Bitcoin, but now there are lots of blockchains, particularly in the NFT space. We are talking about Ethereum, for the most part, is the most popular, but we have other platforms. We have Solana, Tezos, etc., etc. So a blockchain is just an entry in this ledger, and it's available for everyone to see. If you know the address of the transaction that you're looking for, you can just enter something like Etherscan, which allows you to look at all of these transactions. Also, a concept that is going to be useful when we're talking about NFTs is a concept of smart contracts. A smart contract is very simply some code that has been implemented in a common language. One of the most used languages right now is called Solidity, which is used in the Ethereum space. And this is just code that is going to write instructions that are going to be automated and can be performed unwritten in the blockchain, of course. They're usually pegged to a cryptocurrency that this allows for payment transactions. So in the case of NFTs, as we're going to see, this allows you to buy and sell the tokens. I'll explain a little bit more about that later. Also, a transaction is a contract that gets written in the blockchain. And in principle, we are talking about immutable code that is openly verifiable transactions. Now, the mutability of the code is a matter of debate. This means that once written in the blockchain, in principle, it cannot be changed other than whether or not the contract allows you to make changes to it. Tokens are really, and this is another technical term, is just a piece of code. It's a digital representation of a good or service that is written in a blockchain. And it can represent absolutely anything. It can represent a character in a game. It can represent a work of art. It can represent things like airline tickets, frequent flyer miles, provenance coins, etc., etc. And this is always going to be represented as a smart contract, and this gets written in the blockchain. You can have tokens for lots of things. There are all sorts of applications of tokens. I'm not going to go into this, but there are very different types of tokens. Specifically to what matters to us during this presentation is non-fungible tokens. Now, this is a development that is not very new. Around 2017, we start seeing the first non-fungible tokens. Some people argue that the rare pepes were the first NFT. This was not exactly what we understand as an NFT before now, but these were cards that were unique and were written into a blockchain. They were rare, and some of them sold for very high prices. Around 2017, we start seeing the first real implementations of what we understand now as NFTs, which were CryptoPunks, which are now very popular, and also CryptoKitties. The interesting thing is that I started looking at NFTs back in 2017. I thought it was a very interesting concept, but what happened back then was that the CryptoKitties actually clogged up the Ethereum blockchain. There were about 20,000 people trading at the same time, or attempting to trade at the same time. And this clogged it up so much that it sort of lost a little bit of momentum until 2021, where rest is history. Now, what is really a non-fungible token? What are we talking about when we are dealing with NFTs? Okay, we have two categories of goods. You have fungible goods and you have non-fungible goods. Fungible goods are by definition something that is interchangeable, no matter what thing you're buying or selling. So commodities tend to be fungible. We're thinking about things like silver, gold, oil, grain. All of those are fungible. It doesn't matter which type of silver you get, or gold, or you can buy a barrel of oil and it doesn't matter. So those are by definition fungible. By contrast, non-fungible goods are those that are unique. So for example, you could have a specific silver necklace or a gold statuette or a painting. Those are things that are unique, and therefore, by definition, they can be exchanged. The non-fungible token itself is just a smart contract that represents a non-fungible good, and it will always link to that one item. There are different standards in place. These are standards in the Ethereum environment, but other blockchains have been emerging with similar standards. So we have a token for fungible goods, things like game chips and things like that. And this is ERC20. We have also an improved fungible token standard, which is called ERC223. The standard for non-fungible tokens is called ERC721. And then we have token to transfer funds, which is ERC777. And we also have a token to transfer copyright, which is actually not that popular. I'm a bit surprised by that. And it's ERC1190. What has been happening, particularly since late 2020 and early 2021, is that almost everything is now being turned into an NFT, everything that is digital work. So you have things like music is now being tokenized, art, game items, things like Axie Infinity, games like Axie Infinity have been trying to tokenize and use NFTs. Very popular sport highlights, the NBA shots I've heard they're very popular in the Philippines, and things like collectibles that are profile pictures and other type of collectible items that you can trade. Another important element of the NFT situation is that you can actually mint your own stuff. I've actually done this myself, and you install some of the implementation for the contract, and you can actually mint your own works and upload it into blockchain. Now, this is extremely rare. Most people actually use intermediaries. These are marketplaces that act as third parties between the buyer and the seller. And they may take a commission whenever you're buying in the marketplace. Also, you have to consider that there is something that is called a transaction fees, a gas in some situations, where is a transaction fee that you pay so that you can keep the system running. This is something that is paid to the miners, for example, so that they can keep the blockchain operating. We have lots of different intermediaries that have emerged. OpenSea, Mintable, Rarible, Cent Foundation, just to name a few. And also traditional corporations are starting to get in the game. So things like companies like Christie's are now operating in this arena. Some large corporations are starting to get in the act as well. Roughly speaking, there are three types of NFT. There is, for example, a work that is uploaded in its entirety to the blockchain. This is called on-chain work. This is actually quite rare. Is due to prohibitive cost. To make a long story short, the system, the Ethereum system particularly, has been created to make it more expensive for large amounts of information to go into the chain, because it would generally slow down the system if you had lots of transactions of this nature that are quite large. So the system favors small amounts of information. So you can do an on-chain work, but it's going to be generally not. It's going to be very expensive. So this is not common. Another type of NFT is a smart contract that supposedly transfer copyright. This is also not that common. Some platforms allow you to do this. I have legal questions of whether or not ticking a box saying that you have transferred copyright when you're selling or purchasing something, whether or not this is actually a proper transfer of a work. I personally do not think so. And the most common one is an NFT where there is just code that is uploaded to a blockchain. I'm going to show you examples of each one of these. This is, for example, on-chain asset. The first one is called Avastars. It's a project where they upload the entire image to the blockchain. I'll let you judge the artistic merits of this. And in some ways, CryptoPunks are actually now available on-chain. There are questions of whether or not this is actually on-chain, but I'll leave that later. An example of a licensed asset is Bored Apes. These are actually, people are not buying the asset, but they are getting a license on this. We are probably going to discuss this later when we talk about copyright issues. And the most common type of NFT is an ERC-721 contract, which is mostly just metadata. And this metadata is going to be have definitions, but it can have a name, etc., etc. But the most important thing is actually going to be two things. The ERC-721 standard has only two requirements, actually. It says that contract address, that is the blockchain address where the contract can be found, and a token ID. This is a unique number identifier that can be generated by the user, but is most of the times generated by the platform. The token can include all sorts of other information, a title, author, but most common is a URL to the work and the creator's wallet. All right. This is an example in the picture that you can see is one I created, and you can see all the elements. This is the NFT, really. That is it. I really like this one. This comes from the metadata. It comes from an article by Juliet Moringello and Christopher Odinet called The Property Law of Tokens. And this actually shows you what an NFT really is. You can see it's the contract address, the token ID, you can add other information like the token name, and very important, the address, the address to where the image can be found, but also the address of the original creator that tells you that this comes from this address. So really, an NFT is this. I like this explanation. An NFT is two entries into a blockchain, the token ID and the contract owner ID. To give you a bit of a few statistics, I don't want to overrun a lot, but This is from a recent report. I think it was published in the last 3 weeks. That was published in Nature, and they looked at thousands and thousands of NFTs. The average price of an NFT is lower than $15 for 75% of the assets, and larger than $1,594 for 1% of the assets. So only 1% of people make really life-changing money. For the most part, for the vast majority of people, they don't sell for that much. So the top 10% of traders as well alone perform 85% of all transactions and trade at least once, 97% of all assets. So there is a very high concentration as well on traders. Very few traders that are performing most of the transactions. Also, an interesting thing that is presented in this study is that NFTs price correlates strongly with the price of NFTs previously sold within the same collection. So if one collection is successful, it's likely that the other NFTs that are going to be sold are going to be successful as well. I wanted to show you a few, just an example of how this works in reality. As I said, I created a few NFTs. So this is one that I created, is just a work that I made tracing my mouse and clicks during one day. And this is the result. I don't know if it's very pretty. But what you do with the artwork, the recommended thing that you have to do is to upload it to something that's called IPFS service, that is Interplanetary File Service. This allows you to have decentralized storage of the asset. So you upload that, and then you have to connect your wallet, and you have to have funds most of the time. If you're working with Ethereum, generally the most common one is called MetaMask. And you need to have some funds unless you're using a gasless service. So in this case, I used a gasless service to upload my artwork. By the way, it hasn't sold. This version, and now it exists as a contract on the blockchain for everyone to see, and you can see that there. However, it's not unique. I uploaded this to another blockchain, and it's sold on the other blockchain, but not on the Ethereum blockchain. It's sold on the Tezos blockchain. I'm the proud owner of some works. I think that we're going to now move to copyright. I have a few other slides on copyright, but we'll wait for Michelle to give an introduction on the copyright aspects. Right, let me stop sharing. And Michelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Condomus, for introducing us to the world of NFTs, and for that very informative and interesting presentation. I'm pretty sure everybody recognized the memes that you flashed. And now, to further expand on the topic of NFTs, we are also honored and delighted to have Michelle Woods, who is the Director of Copyright Law Division, the Copyright and Creative Industries sector of the World Intellectual Property Organization. Director Woods, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. Share my screen. Let's try that again. Does that look correct?
Yes, we
Great.
can see the presentation.
Excellent. So thank you so much. And I am a little nervous to follow Andres, who's a real expert. We recommended him for this, but we're asked to give our institutional sort of overview perspective as well, which I will try to do. But I would say, Andres, please do feel free to break in, or at the end to add your copyright slides, which I think will probably be more focused on the topic. I'm really looking at things from somewhat higher policy level. So, but very happy to be here and to do that. And then really looking forward to talking with everyone about these topics. So for us here, when we look at NFTs, we are seeing basically a continuum of here's one of the more recent disruptive digital technologies that's come along and that affects the copyright marketplace. And it reflects, like many of the newer technologies, the global impact of digital technologies. And so we often are looking at the relationship of that to copyright law, and copyright law, as I'll mention again, is still largely territorial at the national level. We do work on harmonization, for example, through international agreements at WIPO, but there are a lot of aspects that aren't covered by that kind of harmonization. And so harmonization may over time occur in the marketplace or, for example, through regional agreements. And in general, with these newer disruptive technologies, we'll see a pattern where the role of them, their uses will evolve quickly so that even a year or so later, the way things are developing may be somewhat different from what was seen initially. And so policymakers will be looking at this, Copyright Office, but not only Copyright Office, and saying, is regulation needed? Usually we find some asking for regulation, others saying, no, let the market develop. Are there risks and harms that need to be mitigated while letting the market largely develop? Or is it possible to encourage voluntary industry action, as perhaps we see some of the platforms that operate in this area taking that? Or if there's no other action, then probably in those countries such as the one I come from, which are perhaps a little more litigious than some others, it's probably going to end up in the courts. And so you're probably going to end up with judge-made law. And, that can be fine, but there are different approaches to these things. And we'll mention that there are some cases starting on NFTs in the copyright area. And so that's something to keep an eye on. So there have been these headlines recently of NFTs sold for vast sums of money. This is interesting, contrasting this with the slide with the data from Nature Andres had about the average value or the trends in terms of the value, but these are the headlines that CryptoPunk's NFT bundle goes for 17 million in a Christie's auction. There was another Christie's auction, the third item here, a JPG file sells for 69 million. Internet original source code sold as NFT for 5.4 million. Jack Dorsey sells his first tweet as an NFT for 2.9 million. There have also been, for example, popular internet memes sold, not for quite this much, but still a substantial chunk for those where they originated. But one thing I do want to note here is that we do see some of the misunderstanding about what is actually being sold when someone purchases an NFT in these kinds of headlines, because there's a combination of the NFT and the underlying work. So where you see sells his first tweet as an NFT, well, that's not really how the transaction works, as you just heard, or what is actually sold. most of the time. So you can, as you just heard from Andres, you can have transfer of copyright associated with purchase of an NFT, but that is not necessarily the case, and it's not part of the official standard. So what is the relationship to copyright? Well, for first, NFTs are minted and traded now very frequently with respect to underlying works that are often protected by copyright. So art, video, digital art, video games, photographs, videos, music, all of these areas are being exploited, and many of the works, not all, but many, are in copyright, or at least potentially, when looking at them, would likely be subject to copyright, at least in many jurisdictions. So that's one important relationship to copyright. Often the underlying digital work is something that is in copyright or could be in copyright. But then there's also this confusion we noted before about the relationship between ownership of an NFT and ownership of copyright rights in the underlying work. Even if there's, for example, a link to where to find the digital work online, that doesn't mean there are any rights associated with that given to the person who purchased the NFT, or those rights could be limited, for example. So what is being acquired? I don't need to spend a lot of time on this because you just heard a lot from Andres on this, and I think he mentioned 2 entries into a blockchain. That's what you're getting. So while an underlying digital work is needed at the beginning of the process, and the metadata may contain a URL directed to the work or not, that is the basic transaction involves those 2 codes he was mentioning, and there may be more, metadata. So you may basically have a set of metadata. And it's really a case-by-case assessment to see whether there's actually anything related to copyright rights or related rights that's transmitted as part of the purchase. So the underlying, you have to look at each case, and the underlying digital file doesn't have to be in copyright. We're talking about copyright here. It's a copyright symposium, copyright forum, but the subject or the object, I guess, related to the NFT doesn't even need to be something that would be in the category of a potential copyrighted work. There are other NFTs, for example, in the trademark realm. And even if the underlying work is in copyright, the rights aren't automatically transferred. And if there is any transfer, it can be regulated by contract, and it may not be to all rights. So it's really important, if you're in the business of purchasing NFTs, which I understand some of you are, to at least understand what you're getting and what you're not getting. That may be fine with you in the context of the NFTs that you're purchasing, for example, but for some of these major purchasers, it has become apparent that they did not realize the limitations on what they were getting. So not going to go into this again. We've talked about that already. But in terms of if the underlying digital object is in copyright, potential for transfer, another item that would have to be looked at there, even if it's possible on a platform to easily transfer all or some rights as part of the transaction, is that valid under the applicable national law? And of course, in digital transactions across border, even figuring out the applicable national law sometimes can be a question. But putting that aside, if you know the law you're analyzing, you may need to see whether there are some formalities in that law. Could be as simple as many copyright laws or general laws on contract will require, a contract in order to transfer copyright will require perhaps a signature. Then, so you could say, well, we have the electronic versions of these things. Well, in some systems, those are recognized more and more, but it isn't necessarily the case yet for these types of smart contracts and e-signatures in every jurisdiction. So that's something, if this is a significant transaction, that one would want to be aware of and conscious of. And here we come back to some of these fundamental principles of copyright, that it's territorial, that you do need to look at the situation in different jurisdictions, which may vary on some of these questions, including what is in copyright. For example, I don't know, a sports clip that in one country might be treated as news of the day, not copyrightable. In another country might be in copyright as long as it's as there's a fixation, for example. Copyright is also divisible, so some rights could be given, others could be retained, or rights could be given licensed for a limited period. For example, also, there could be permission to use for personal use or for non-commercial use, but not for any commercial use. That could be retained by the copyright holder or another rights owner. So all that needs to be kept in mind. So then in terms of thinking forward about what role NFTs might play in the digital copyright ecosystem, and Andres mentioned some of these items as well, and perhaps if he wants to come in on any of these. I don't have a lot to say about them, but they are areas people are looking at, and these could be areas where we see, for example, businesses developed around the concept of NFTs, but there would need to be certain elements worked out. So for example, NFTs could be used for a type of digital registration function, perhaps some kind of private registration system. Could potentially be used as a licensing mechanism, have been talked about a lot as a method of verification, of proof that basically the blockchain, it is what it is. It reflects whatever is there at the time. However, abuses are possible because while that is true, it is quite easy for people who don't have the rights in an underlying work to nevertheless mint an NFT and go through this process where once that becomes part of the blockchain, it is not something easy to reverse. And so there can be many complaints, and there have been complaints with artists saying, or creators of different types saying, wait, their works are NFTs, they didn't authorize that, they didn't know about that. And so there needs to be some kind of ongoing monitoring functions, response functions, and someone needs to provide all that infrastructure. That may be these platforms that are involved with NFTs, and some of them are certainly considered sort of good sources of verification. But at the same time, having this source of proof may prove less than the buyer thinks that they're getting. And the system may be somewhat cumbersome. So I think this is an area where we'll see more evolution over the upcoming years about different experimentation with how to use NFTs and perhaps try and build systems and businesses around them. This should be an area where we're seeing innovation evolving quickly. Here at WIPO, we're very focused on helping creators. We've got a new project called WIPO for Creators, new public-private partnership. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how NFTs might help creators. But Andres, did you want to say something?
No.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
I just saw your.
Not yet.
Okay.
No.
Okay. You can. I've just got a couple more slides, and happy to have your views on some of these things. As I said, you're the real expert on this. We read all your material all the time here. So how can NFTs help creators? They can provide options for monetization with smart contracts, ideally across broad geographic reach, even including those who may not be in countries with really well developed digital distribution systems, for example, through collective management. They can be a revenue source for established creators who are able to monetize their NFTs. Potentially, we've seen a few examples, and this could turn into a sort of trend. They could be a source of funding, even to create content where people are selling shares in content that they're creating, and saying that perhaps even some of the revenue could go back to those who buy these very small segments, like 1 second of a clip, for example. So it could be a way to monetize funds in order to create more content. Then there could be rights management functions using the metadata. That's something, data is everything right now in terms of what people are looking at in terms of trying to build additional tools that basically help creators to monetize their works and thus to contribute to national creative industries and the global creative economy. In practical terms, it may be a good way to facilitate payments in real time, payments for ongoing sales if there's application of a resale provision, the concept that's actually in the Berne Convention, but could be applied to certain types of works, or could be added as a licensing feature or a condition in the NFT. So a lot of this is still in the early stages, but there is some potential here to use NFTs to help creators, not just those who are able to monetize for these amounts that get our attention because they're so high. Did want to say a little bit about potential for copyright infringement and whether creation or the mining of a token could potentially be an infringement. And here we need to look again at the basics of copyright and see whether in fact copyright or related rights are implicated. You can't have infringement unless you have some rights that are implicated. And Andres mentioned the on-chain works. Those maybe there could be a better case that there are rights that are implicated, but where in fact the underlying work is not transferred, maybe there's a link to it, maybe there's not. If there's a link, is that enough? Would that potentially be communication to the public, or whatever that is called in the national system? We find that in laws, they don't always use that terminology, but the concept might be there. Maybe, but once again, you might have to be looking at the law of specific jurisdictions, whether that be local or regional. So it might need an analysis. And then moral rights, that's not an economic infringement that would have damages necessarily, or the category is different. But here you have to be aware that moral rights could remain. In some systems, moral rights are not transferable. They may be perpetual, so they could even continue while the work itself is in the public domain. And speaking about the work being in the public domain, there are also some concerns around the situation, and it's not only in the context of NFTs, but has been raised here, the possibility of people creating tokens around works that are in the public domain and trying perhaps to use that as a way to control those works and even to monetize them when in fact those works should be freely available. So that is sometimes called copy fraud and can be a concern as well. I have a little graphic here with a lot of the rights that could potentially be implicated, and we don't need to go through all of them, fortunately, but a lot of these rights really probably would not be implicated by an NFT transaction, even if it does involve some kind of transfer of copyright rights. So we'd have to figure out, well, what rights actually would be implicated, particularly if there was a concern to bring an infringement action, for example. And some infringement litigation has started. What I'm familiar with is some cases that are well known in the US. I'm sure there may be some others around the world, but a couple cases that have gotten a lot of attention because of the well-known individuals involved. Jay-Z for the reasonable doubt NFTs that were proposed, Quentin Tarantino being the subject of a copyright infringement action by a studio for trying to distribute or create and sell NFTs related to Pulp Fiction. So these kinds of cases are being filed. It may be some time before we get decisions that really grapple with these issues. Who knows, these may be settled. You don't know as they make their way through the legal system, but the copyright infringement claim is being made in court cases. So eventually we will start to get a chain of cases on this. And this goes to the point I was making that if it's not regulated in another way, it may be regulated through court decisions. But even here, the issues are more who has rights and can monetize them through NFTs. It's not so much that the NFTs themselves are the subject, but this does illustrate that just because you have the ability to make arrangements and to mine tokens for monetization, that doesn't mean that you have in some way proved that you actually have the rights or have the copyright ownership. So it's an area one still has to be careful about. Mentioned this before, but the role of platforms is important here in this newer area. And platforms really have an important role, an essential role, and a lot of power, relatively speaking. And for example, usually at the moment, infringement claims are being dealt with through a process of, for example, takedown notices being filed, complaints being made to the platform, platforms getting safe harbor protections or whatever the equivalent of that is in the local law. So in the US, there have been Digital Millennium Copyright Act notices filed. And so a lot of that is, voluntary, I suppose, voluntary in the sense of preferring to be voluntary rather than have something imposed, but by the platforms that operate in this area. And I think it's just interesting to consider, for example, as the responsibilities of many content distribution platforms are being considered in Europe, in Australia, in different parts of the world, whether that consideration will have some kind of spillover effect into the NFT marketplace. So in terms of potential regulation, I will say quite honestly, we have not heard a lot of interest about this at WIPO. We're more getting requests for information to understand better, to understand the links between NFTs and blockchain as a whole, and intellectual property, all kinds of intellectual property, not just copyright. So it's really for our member states kind of early days. They want to understand this. follow the market, see what's happening, and see whether they think they need to take any action. The role of standards, we heard about the ERC 721 NFT standard, also the others, for example, for copyright transfer. So standard setting is an important way to harmonize that is not normative in the sense of having a treaty or a binding agreement or something of that nature, but has a role in terms of the harmonization that's quite important. We have a committee on WIPO standards that works on certain standards related to intellectual property, and they're actually talking right now in the broader sense, not just focused on NFTs, of course, but about standard setting with respect to blockchain and the intersection with intellectual property. So then we also have what's now called our Frontier Technologies Division. Formerly, it was focused more on artificial intelligence, but now their mandate is broader, and they are looking at the topic of NFTs, blockchain, the whole area, and doing what we've been doing in this area in response to what the member states ask for, which is to really host discussions and conversations, to bring people together, convene people from across the world to discuss what they're seeing, how they're addressing it, if they're addressing it, what their future plans might be, what innovations we can expect. And so at the moment, what we're mainly seeing is the start of perhaps some efforts to apply existing laws, like particularly, for example, existing copyright laws, and to see whether that's adequate, with the sense that if there's any sort of tweaks needed to address this particular disruptive technology, that would still be some ways down the road. That would not be something we'd expect to be seeing very soon. We may very well see national studies, national examination of this topic. Some of that's going on, but the harmonization either may come from the marketplace itself, or if it is something that's going to be coming from member states, they would want to do a lot more thinking, evaluating, studying before they would be ready to even discuss that. So I will stop there and look forward to talking with all of you about your interests in this area. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Director Woods, for giving us an overview on the possible effects of NFT in policymaking and, of course, clarifying certain issues of ownership of NFT and copyright. With the skyrocketing prices of NFTs, this technology will surely play a significant role in the coming years. But before we move on to our open forum, I think it would be best for us to take a picture of this moment. Maybe we'll have an NFT created for this screenshot, right? So if I may invite our panel, our distinguished members of the IPOFIL and the rest of the audience to open their cameras and maybe hold their smiles for a few seconds. On my mark. Okay. Just give them a few more seconds. And okay. For the organizers, please do let me know if we're done taking screenshots. So on my mark, let's give our best smile, because this will be minted as an NFT. I'm just kidding. Okay, 1, 2, 3, and smile. And hold. And hold. Are we done?
You're kidding. I can actually mint it if you want. Yeah, just send it to me.
I think that would be a good idea. Okay, so maybe let's proceed with the question and answer. I already received a few questions from our audience. So again, if I may invite our distinguished members of the panel to the floor. Andres and Michelle. Okay, there we go. So for the first question, here's the thing. How do you transfer NFTs after the initial sale? I understand this is quite a complex process, especially it involves a blockchain, but a lot of our audience here are quite new to this concept. So after the initial sale, how can we transfer the NFT? Will the uploaded image follow the transfer, or is it just the code within that smart contract that will be transferred to the buyer?
Excellent question. I can probably show you. I don't know if I can show my screen. All right, let's see. This would, all right. So I bought this NFT. The NFT is not this image. So first we need to make sure that we know what I bought is not the image. The underlying image is hosted in a server somewhere. I have no control over the image. I can save it. I can right click it, as people say, and I can save a copy myself. But so can everyone else in the world. What I own is some code and is represented by this image. So now what I'm doing is in the same platform where I bought this is in the Solana blockchain, I am reselling this. If you want to buy it, I am the owner of this. You would see if you had your wallet connected with enough money or enough cryptocurrency Solana, you would be able to see here purchase or buy. So what you would see is that I am the second owner of this, and you would buy it from me, and then that can transfer. What happens is that this code inhabits my wallet right now, but I can transfer it, and once I sell it, it's no longer in my wallet. It belongs to someone else. Now the image, I will keep it. I have it in my computer. I'll keep it forever. But the actual token, which is the NFT, which is what people are buying or selling, is going to be transferred. Yeah, I don't know if that explains or answers the question.
And I think, excuse me, a useful point there is from the data you showed before that a lot of the resales are on the same platform where the initial sales took place. So they're kind of within these somewhat closed circles. The big Christie's auctions or whatever, that's unusual. And the activity tends to be more something like what you were showing us.
Yeah, most of the time they're going to be in the same platform. Yeah.
That's interesting. So NFTs, well, basically what's being transferred is really the contract and not the image. Okay. So then we also have another question. Technically speaking, the minter can change the image that the link points to, especially if it's not hosted on IPFS.
Yes. It's a big problem. That's one of the reasons why people recommend IPFS. Imagine I mint something and I have it in my server and I switch the image to something else. Yeah, that can happen. Or also it could be hosted in a service that goes out of business or something like that. Then it would disappear. There are now hundreds, if not thousands, of NFTs in circulation right now that are linking to have broken links. Yeah, the figure is impossible to tell, but there are studies that are telling us that. Yeah.
So really, NFTs are very technical. But before we move on to this technical aspect of NFTs, maybe you could tell us why are NFTs popular? Why do people buy NFTs in the first place? Maybe Michelle or Andres would like to answer. Michelle? Yeah?
To be honest, I don't buy NFTs. This would be really speculation on my part. But I think it's part of a larger, some of the scenarios we see like within gaming, et cetera, it's part of trends that also there are other items that people purchase or other things that people do to personalize and to engage more directly within games. And there's a lot of commerce going on within gaming. So I assume some of that is those trends. If the people buying the high ticket items, I think it's kind of for bragging rights, hey, I own this, and they think they own it, but they actually probably don't own much of anything. Depends, but you hear those cases of you can buy the work and then, or buy the NFT and destroy the underlying work. This is rare, of course, but there have been cases like that proposed at least. And so it kind of focuses on the uniqueness that you're the only person and the last person who owns that, and I think it's a similar instinct to people collecting art, many other things. Andres, I don't know if you have other thoughts on that, but
yeah, no, it's really. I think some people have described it as digitized hipsterism. I think it's a really, really nice idea. It's bragging rights. Yeah, that people. Why do people buy items in games? As someone that is a gamer, I do buy stuff sometimes, so I cannot judge anyone for buying a digital asset. I think it's just the reason why people is to say that it's theirs, but the problem is that it's not really theirs. That's where the ownership question comes into being. You're not buying the underlying asset, you're buying digital metadata that tells you that you are the owner of that one link.
I think you were telling us earlier, right, that for the NBA, you really don't get anything for those, right?
No, you don't get. They police their rights very strongly, and when you read their terms and conditions, you get nothing. You get the nice picture, the nice video, the square thing, but that is not the work itself. You cannot use it. You cannot resell it. You can resell the token, but you cannot resell the rights. You cannot show that in television or broadcast it or anything. Yeah, they're not giving you any rights whatsoever. It's what you own is bragging rights that you own an amazing shot by. I don't know. They have historic ones like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or Magic Johnson or something. Yeah, it's bragging rights exactly.
I myself can't really judge people buying digital items because I keep on buying these cute little costumes for my characters in my online games. So given what you said earlier, that it's primarily because of bragging rights. So is it correct to say that NFTs really don't have any intrinsic value, or do they have intrinsic value?
What is intrinsic value? Really, it's an interesting philosophical question, almost like when you think about it, what is the worth of a song? Is it worth nothing, or is it worth the? It depends on the situation. If it's your wedding song or the song that was playing when you had a really, really strong emotion, that song can be worth everything to you. So to me, the actual worth is whatever someone is willing to pay for it. And now, personally, I think that some NFTs are not worth the bits they're written in. I don't particularly find them nice, but who am I to judge? Precisely.
I don't know if we're going to respond to this question in the chat, but there's a question saying, I understand that when you purchased an NFT item, you already have the right of ownership. Does it mean the intellectual property right of the item also comes with it? I think the clear answer from what we've been saying is most of the time, no. And you need to really check that. And if what you want is to acquire the intellectual property right, you need to make sure that transfer happens. But that would be very unusual and probably would not be like the NFTs you're buying in games or these NBA tokens or anything of that nature where you basically have the choice to buy it or not buy it. You're not having a personal negotiation over it. In those cases, most of the time, you are not getting an intellectual property right for the underlying item. You're getting this NFT, which, as Andre showed us, is really just this code.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You're not, and this is so difficult for people to understand.
Yeah.
It's conceptually. Just a couple of days ago, Stephen Colbert was describing and explaining what an NFT is in his show, and he got it wrong. And he must have people telling him what it is, but he got it wrong. That he was telling his audience, well, you're actually buying the rights to this work. And I was screaming at the screen and saying, no, you don't. You really don't. You are buying some code. You don't own that image. Okay, maybe some images you can, but I am a strong believer that if you really want to sell the rights to your work, you should accompany it with a real written, signed document, just to make sure. Some countries
certainly if you're the buyer.
Yeah, if you're the buyer, exactly.
You should be asking for that.
Yeah, because lots of systems have formalities in order to assign copyright. And in the UK, where I'm based, you have a written, the assignment of copyright has to be in writing and signed.
Especially on the regulation of NFTs. So earlier, Michelle and Andres really presented the values of the recent sales of certain NFT items or NFT tokens. So given the skyrocketing prices of NFTs, is there a need to regulate NFTs, and should the government step in? Or is it or the voluntary mechanisms, as Michelle already mentioned in her presentation, enough regulation or sufficient regulation to control NFTs?
Mm-hmm. Andres, I don't know if you have a view on that.
I would be skeptical about regulation right now. I think it's too early to tell. I think the market will eventually regulate, particularly, I think, let's wait for the next crash. There is always a crash in the market. So I would expect for some crash to take place before we start regulating. Once that happens, it depends on what you want to regulate. I think potentially the ownership aspect, the transfer aspect could be something that could be tackled by regulation. There is already going to be, or there's already a call for there to be taxation of these assets. The US is moving strongly in this direction, where some of the assets are going to be taxed. So a lot of people are going to find that they are not millionaires as they thought, or maybe it wasn't a good idea. That's where I see the regulation going. I don't think that there is potentially need. I think that there is also potentially consumer regulation that has to take place. Some of these marketplaces are operating sometimes on shoestring technology. There could be situations in which we need to protect consumers who are thinking that they're buying something. Maybe consumer protection mechanisms that tell people, okay, you are not really buying this artwork. You cannot do lots of things with it. With some collectibles, you can print T-shirts. You can use them as your personal avatar, but that's pretty much it. Really, they don't give you lots of rights. Yeah.
And from our, oh, sorry, just very quickly from our perspective, we tend, at the request of all our member states, to be responsive rather than proactive in any kind of encouraging or suggesting any kind of harmonization at the global level, or even regulation at national level if we're asked about that. So our role is really responding to member states. And I will say we're asked a lot for information. We're not hearing at this point for requests, can you draft me a provision in the copyright law? That is not something that we're seeing. And it may be partly because some of these questions actually aren't really copyright law questions. Maybe they're in your law of contracts, or like you said, consumer law, whatever. But at this point, we're not really hearing that, partly because things are evolving very quickly. So the regulators are just trying to keep up with the potential regulators with what's going on here. And they're not ready to formulate some kind of regulation.
And maybe a related question to that is one being asked by our audience. It's Missy. Okay. And she says that a huge issue surrounding NFTs is its environmental impact, especially from the mining of Ethereum. So how can artists and buyers get into sustainable crypto art, especially now in a global climate crisis?
This is something I can talk a little bit about because one of the biggest concerns I've ever had with cryptocurrencies in general and blockchain is precisely the environmental impact. I'm going to say this is just my personal opinion. Please do not reflect. It does not reflect anyone else's. I think that proof of work blockchains are damaging to the environment. Ethereum is going to move eventually to something that's called proof of stake. By the way, proof of work means you need lots of computing power to mine the cryptocurrency. It can be very, very damaging to the environment depending on the type of energy that you're using. I have to say, things like Bitcoin, potentially very, very harmful to the environment, which is entirely proof of work. Ethereum is still proof of work, but it's moving to proof of stake, which is you don't mine. What you do is you put some of your assets in. The network is run by people like putting savings. I don't know if that makes sense. It's called staking, and so you separate some of your assets so that they help to run the system. Those systems are more environmentally friendly. Ethereum eventually is going to move into that, and it's not yet there. And I think in part of it is because of the reluctance from miners to fully move to a system where they're going to be disadvantaged economically. It's like asking turkeys to vote for Christmas. I think eventually it's going to happen. Now, there are some other blockchains that are fully proof of stake and they're ecologically friendly. Tezos and Solana are the two main ones. By the way, I don't want to be seen as I'm promoting a specific blockchain, but yeah, those are just two that are already operating, selling NFTs, where they are environmentally friendly. So artists, they're cheaper as well. Ethereum now is so expensive. The transaction gas is very, very expensive. So one of the advantages of the environmentally friendly ones is also that they're cheaper to operate. Yeah. Oh, I have some funds in Ethereum that I cannot get out because it's too expensive.
Yeah, I would only add to that that this is an area where also people want information, and where it's relatively recent that the full scope of the environmental impact, I think, has become clear, or at least has become clear to those who might be in a position to regulate, but who are perhaps not active in these systems and on these platforms themselves. So it's very much an area for us at this point of education, because we also have some environmental initiatives here, education, and it is something we're looking at. For example, we have this WIPO for Creators initiative when thinking, how do we address these topics, and how do we, for example, encourage creators from developing countries to use some of these resources. That's an aspect we want to take into account. And so we're trying to think through the best ways to do that, and probably some of what you're suggesting in terms of using certain types of platforms rather than others might be part of that. But we're at the relatively early stages of that part of the thinking, but really trying to make sure that there's awareness around this. And actually, I know that's not just us, but a UN-wide initiative. So
Thank you. So maybe let's move on to the other aspects of other categories of questions that we have for you. So here's a question from Miss Mary Ann Reyes. What exactly are you buying when you buy an NFT? Is it just really the code?
Yes.
And a
Yes.
follow-up to that, okay, and a follow-up to that also comes from a member of the audience, that will it be subject to the right of an artist to profit from any resale of the original version of his artwork? What do you think, considering that they're just buying the code?
Oh,
Well,
this is actually.
go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say very quickly it could, but let you explain how that could happen.
All right. So this is actually one of the very interesting aspects of NFTs that some artists really like. You can build into the contract a resale
Royalty, right?
system, like a royalty. Yeah. So you get anything from 1% to 50% of the resale you get back. So a good standard is about 10%. I've sold about 4 NFTs so far, however, and I haven't received any money from that. So that may be a situation. But yeah, you can build into the system after each resale, you get money back. Yeah, which is nice for the artist, I think.
Sure.
Yeah, and that's a right that it's optional in the Berne Convention, but it's actually in the Berne Convention for visual artworks, which are usually thought of as paintings or sculptures, so physical artworks, although it would be possible for member states to define them in their copyright laws to include digital works. So here that this is accomplishing something by contract that could also be, and is in some national laws, as a right of the artist for those visual artworks. And we actually have a topic on our agenda of the Standing Committee on Copyright on this topic, and there are a number of member states asking, at least for the visual artwork aspect, to have an international treaty on the topic. So when I hear this, I'm thinking like, wow, if we ever get into that discussion and negotiation, we would, the committee would need to consider whether they're going to try and then extend that into the digital realm. So something very interesting to think about, but it's also good to see that it can be done by contract. And from what I've read, the smart contracts are reliable, and as long as people have set up within the particular platform, this works pretty automatically, which is much better than a lot of the metadata that is available for a lot of works, for example, that are registered in national copyright offices, where even if there's a willingness to pay, it might be hard to find the information about the conditions or to whom the payment should be made, this kind of thing. So that's one of the potential positive uses of NFTs in these situations.
And then we also have another question. I think you briefly discussed this earlier, Michelle. So you mentioned earlier that there are some NFTs that were created without the consent of the original artist or author of the work. So what happens if, for example, an NFT was created that infringes the copyright of another? Earlier, Andres presented a Homer Pepe card, which is fashioned in the likeness of a Magic the Gathering card. And of course, it is a derivative work from The Simpsons. So what will happen to that? How can you remove an NFT that's already circulating from the blockchain, considering that that is almost impossible to tamper with?
You cannot remove it from the blockchain initially, but you can remove it from the platform. So what is emerging is that platforms are becoming the police of the NFT space. So to give you an example, a Bored Ape user got 3 of his NFTs stolen, and they were removed by the platform. If you find that your artwork is being shared in the platform without your permission, then you can remove it as well. You can ask them for removal. So it's still in the blockchain, but the platforms have a lot of power, so it would be removed from the platform. Yeah, it's still there, but it's not there.
Yeah. And this does bring up that this is another area where major rights holders would need to, and there's a business opportunity, of course. I'm sure there's already something in operation where you affirmatively need to monitor. In reality, it'd be nice to say that's not your responsibility, but because platforms, yes, they'll take it down, but they're going to do that when it's requested. Maybe occasionally they're monitoring or they see something that looks funny, but for the most part, they're responding to the rights owner coming to them. So the rights owners, so all of the big rights holder conglomerations have to add this to the areas where they're constantly reviewing and searching to see what's there and whether they see some of their copyrighted works and need to lodge, if it's in the US DMCA complaints, if it's in other jurisdictions, use whatever their system is, or sometimes the platforms have their own system set up and you can go to them through that. But yes, so it's a burden on, there are opportunities there, but it can also be a burden.
Thank you, Andres and Michelle, for your answers. So maybe we're going to have one final question because we are running out of time, unfortunately. So the final question is, can a sound recording be a subject of an NFT?
Oh yeah. Anything, any digital item. There is already anything that you can put in a link. You can make an NFT of. Some videos or sound recording, whatever you want. Yeah, absolutely. There is already a few people that are doing this. There is a French artist that broke up his one of his songs into an NFT per second. So people buy an NFT. What they're buying is a second of the song. And yeah, it can be done. It's if people are playing with the technology, with the business models, it's interesting. But yeah, the sound recording, anything you can upload it to an IPFS server. You can put anything as an NFT then. And then what you're selling is access to that file. Yeah, as an exclusive. Once someone buys it, they can download that. Yeah.
Okay, and maybe I'm going to ask any final words before we end the session, Michelle.
So, I've been following some of the comments here, and it's interesting to see some of the perspectives from people on thinking about this, about how NFTs can work and what they're really getting, and needing. So I guess I would end by reiterating that this is still an area where, because it's highly unregulated and because there's a lot of innovation going on, it's really important, if you're considering getting into this area, to really know what you're getting, work with reputable partners, and whether you're on the selling side or the buying side, to really know what is happening with underlying copyright rights and whether in fact you're obtaining any of those or selling any of those, and being very conscious of all that. So proceed with caution.
Andres, yes? Do you have any final words?
I would completely second that. I think that there is a lot of hype. There's a lot of FOMO, fear of missing out, being sold. People are almost pushed into, oh, I have to participate right now. I have to invest. And sometimes you have to make sure that you're buying into a reputable project with, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. There are lots of scammers out there, so yeah, be careful. The Squid Game NFT or token is a good example of that. That was an unlicensed work. If it's unlicensed, don't buy into it. Yeah, make sure that the person that you think you're buying it from is really the person issuing it. Yeah, be careful with the scammers. Lots of scammers around.
So again, with that, we end our discussion on NFTs. So this was very fruitful discussion, especially for our artists, because this provides them another avenue to commercialize their works. So with that, again, Andres and Michelle, thank you again very much for accepting the invitation for the picks. To the audience, let's give our experts a round of applause for this very interesting discussion. And now?
Thank you again for the invitation. It was fantastic.
And now I turn back the floor to our organizers. Thank you for listening to this session.
Bye, everyone.